Yesterday I was telling you a little bit about my very early life on the farm. There were a few things that I probably should have explained a little bit better. Um, I was born in 1939, so I'm going to be 80 tomorrow, which um, puts me in a position to talk about life in the 40s and 50s as a child, a youngster, and to explain a little bit more about how um, how we lived back then. Um, it was very safe. It was a very safe world. We didn't have much in the way of danger at all. Um, the only strangers who ever passed through were really the hobos who rode the train, which was about not very far from my house, where I was as a little girl. And apparently, we had a face of a cat on the door, which meant that my family was friendly to hobos. Uh, they rode the freight trains, and they would hop off and hop on and go to the local homes and grab a bite to eat if they could. Um, Maybe do some little chores for the people who lived there, and that was how they lived, um, on their way to nowhere, but it was their life. So we had hobos, and I knew about them, even as a little girl. I knew I was supposed to watch out for them, of course, and I was supposed to be careful, but um, the hobos were there, and by golly, when I heard about them and how they lived and rode the freight trains and they seemed so free, I wanted to be a hobo too. So at the age of 4, I think, one day I took a bandana. I remember it was a red bandana like a cowboy's, and I put a little red dish in it, filled with peas of all things. And um, what else did I put in the bandana? Gee, I don't remember. But I tied up the bandana and tied it to a stick. And here I was, 4 years old, striding off toward the railroad tracks, which, as I said, were maybe half a mile away. Um, and I had my cat under my arm. My cat went with me everywhere. She was a gray and white kitty. Now, this one I remember. I don't remember her name, but she was a lovely little cat that I absolutely adored. So, me and my hobo-ish Ness went walking off toward the railroad station with my cat under my arm and my knapsack on a stick over my shoulder. Well, we got almost all the way to the railroad tracks, and we had to cross a street in order to get to the station. And when I got that far, guess what? I remembered I wasn't allowed to cross the street alone. So I just stood there for a little while and watched the trains, and because they were pretty frequent in those days, long, long trains with a great big black engine at the front and a caboose at the back, and there was always a couple of waves from the train engineers and conductors, especially for a little girl, and I would wave back, and then finally, I turned around and went home. That I remember. So I did my stint as a hobo, which was lots of fun for me. And I'm sure my parents knew where I was and were following me, or at least had a very close eye on me. Um, I think Peggy was still around at that point, so she must have been right on my heels. In any event, that was my big adventure as a hobo. 4 years old, and I was already in school. We had no kindergarten in those days, so I went straight into first grade. And across the street from my house was a great big empty field, and then on the other side of the field was Railroad Avenue, where my Aunt Ida, great Aunt Ida, and great Uncle Adolph lived, in one of those big old Victorian houses with the front porch and the turret and so on. And I walked to school. Not all the time, but almost every day I walked to school. Or if I didn't walk to school, I walked home from school. The school was probably about a mile up a big hill on the west end of town. And I would walk across the field, this big empty field, and then walk up the hill to the school. And after school, I would walk down the hill and walk across to my Aunt Ida's house, and Aunt Ida would have toast and I think it was a glass of milk for me. But the toast was wonderful. It was fresh seeded rye bread, and she would spread schmaltz over the top of the toast. And schmaltz was chicken fat. So chicken fat with a little bit of salt and pepper on fresh seeded rye bread was my afternoon after-school snack. And let me tell you, there's nothing like it again in the rest of my life. We really can't even get that kind of bread anymore. But Aunt Ida made it, and I got to enjoy it and understand what real rye bread and schmaltz tasted like. I can still taste it now. One of these days I'm going to find real corn rye again and make some schmaltz and spread it on the corn rye with a little salt and pepper, and I'll be in heaven. See you tomorrow.